On a quiet November evening in 1996, 17-year-old Jennifer Wendorf returned home from work to find a scene of unimaginable horror in Eustis, Florida. Her father, Richard, lay motionless on the couch, his face unrecognizable from over 20 crowbar strikes, a gaping hole in his head. Her mother, Naomi, still in her bathrobe, lay murdered after stepping out of the shower. The brutality of the scene would haunt even veteran investigators. "I've never seen anything worse," lead detective Al Gucia would later recall. "It was a very gruesome situation. That was probably the worst case I have, or will ever have." The murders rocked the small Florida town, but more shocking revelations were to come. The investigation would uncover a disturbing tale of teenage vampire role-playing turned deadly, led by a 16-year-old who claimed to be a 500-year-old vampire named Vasago. Behind the savage killings was Rod Ferrell, a troubled teenager from Murray, Kentucky, known as the Buckle of the Bible Belt, with one church for every 300 residents. Ferrell had cultivated a small following of outcasts who called themselves the Vampire Clan. Among them was Heather Wendorf, the 15-year-old daughter of the victims. What began as dark fantasy role-playing inspired by the game Vampire, the masquerade had evolved into something far more sinister. Blood-drinking rituals in cemeteries, claims of immortality, and talk of running away to New Orleans' vampire underground set the stage for a night of senseless violence that would forever change multiple young lives. The story of the Vampire Clan murders serves as a chilling reminder of how teenage alienation, neglect, and dark obsessions can spiral into real-world tragedy. But to understand how fantasy turned to murder, we must first examine the troubled past that shaped a teenage killer. At the center of this dark tale stands Rod Ferrell, born in 1980 to a teenage mother in Murray, Kentucky. In a town nicknamed the Buckle of the Bible Belt, where church steeples outnumbered convenience stores and conservative values ruled supreme, Rod emerged as an anomaly that would shake the community's foundations. His mother, Sandra Gibson, embodied instability. After a brief high school romance and marriage to Rod's father, Rick, she quickly found herself a single mother. Flitting between jobs that rarely lasted weeks, Sandra prioritized partying over parenting. Her criminal record revealed disturbing tendencies. She was placed on probation for attempting to seduce a 14-year-old boy during a vampire blood ritual, foreshadowing the dark path her son would take. Rod's grandparents became his reluctant caretakers, stepping in when Sandra disappeared on her escapades. When they confronted her about neglecting Rod, she responded with threats, claiming her drug group would eliminate them. This toxic environment shaped Rod's early years, leaving him without stable guidance or emotional anchoring. The supporting cast in this tragedy emerged as Rod built his vampire clan. Howard Jaden, known by his vampire name, another troubled teen at Callaway County High School, initially welcomed Rod into his own vampire family. Their friendship, forged in mutual alienation, included blood-drinking rituals in Old Salem Cemetery. But even Jaden would later distance himself as Rod's behavior grew increasingly violent. The core members of Rod's eventual clan each brought their own vulnerabilities. Todd Anderson, age 16, came from an abusive home with an alcoholic father. His background of witnessed violence may explain his eventual role as Rod's accomplice in the murders. Charity Casey, 16, became Rod's girlfriend and loyal follower. Despite knowing about murderous plans beforehand, she claimed to have tried dissuading Rod, a defense that would later impact her sentencing. Dana Cooper, at 19 the oldest member, provided a car and adult presence that helped the group move between states. Like Charity, she knew of the violent intentions, but failed to prevent them. Most crucially, there was Heather Wendorf, the the 15-year-old daughter of the future victims. Her relationship with Rod, begun during his brief time in Florida, would prove fatal for her family. Though she maintained ignorance of the murder plans, her role remains controversial. After the murders, she attempted to reinvent herself as Zoe in North Carolina, but couldn't escape her connection to the case. The final key players were the victims themselves. Richard and Naomi Wendorf, whose only crime was being obstacles to their daughter's dark fantasy life. Richard, found beaten beyond recognition on his couch, and Naomi, killed after stepping from her shower, became tragic figures in a story that began as teenage role play and ended in savage reality. Detective Al-Ghoushier, the lead investigator, would later emphasize that this case had nothing to do with vampirism. Rather, it represented the deadly convergence of teenage alienation, neglect, and unchecked, violent tendencies. His insight would prove crucial in separating authentic vampire subculture from the senseless violence that appropriated its imagery. These players, bound together by circumstance and dark obsessions, would craft a narrative that continues to horrify and fascinate. Their story serves as a chilling reminder of how fantasy, when fueled by real-world trauma and left unchecked by adult intervention, can spiral into unthinkable violence. By November 1996, Rod Ferrell's dark fantasies were reaching a breaking point. After his banishment from Jaden's vampire clan for excessive violence, his own group had developed more sinister undertones. Regular blood-drinking rituals in cemeteries weren't satisfying his escalating desires. The catalyst came through his contact with Heather Wendorf. Phone records revealed months of late-night conversations, where she allegedly complained about her parents and restrictive home life. Rod, high on a combination of acid, PCP, and heroin, formulated a plan that merged fantasy with violent reality. The initial scheme seemed simple. Rod, Charity, and Scott would drive from Kentucky to Florida, pick up Heather and Dana, then head to New Orleans, a city Rod believed harbored a thriving vampire community. But their car began breaking down en route to Florida, adding theft to their growing list of intended crimes. On November 25, 1996, Rod took 10 strips of golden dragonfly acid before arriving in Eustis. Rather than merely collecting Heather, he insisted on performing a crossing-over ritual. In a local cemetery, Rod and Heather exchanged blood, making her officially part of his vampire family. This ritual would later take on darker significance. Was it preparation for freedom, or preparation for murder? The group's next moves raised questions about premeditation. Heather met them outside her home but didn't bring the car keys, forcing Rod and Scott to enter the house. They came armed with wooden sticks, later upgrading to a crowbar found in the garage. This preparation suggested more sinister intentions than simple car theft. Rod's girlfriend Charity later admitted to police that she knew of plans to kill the Wendorfs beforehand. Dana Cooper corroborated this, though both claimed they tried to discourage the violence. Most contentiously, Rod insisted Heather had asked him to kill her parents, while she maintained complete ignorance of his intentions. The final hours before the murders painted a picture of escalating madness. Rod, still high on acid, performed what he called a death ritual with his followers. The lines between vampire roleplay and homicidal intent had completely blurred. As dusk fell on November 25th, the fantasy world Rod had constructed was about to violently collide with reality, forever changing multiple young lives. The question that would haunt investigators: was this a spontaneous explosion of drug-fueled violence, or had Rod been methodically planning this moment since his first conversations with Heather? The evidence suggested both, a twisted convergence of long-term fantasy and immediate opportunity that would result in savage murder. At approximately 9:00 p.m. on November 25, 1996, Richard Wendorf lay asleep on his living room couch while his wife Naomi showered upstairs. Rod Ferrell and Scott Anderson entered through the garage, armed with a crowbar found among the tools. The television volume was high, masking their approach. Ferrell's first strike caught Richard Wendorf in the temple. Instead of stopping, he continued beating him, over 20 times by police count. He wouldn't stop breathing, Ferrell later recalled with disturbing detachment, so I took the bottom of the crowbar and stabbed him in the chest. The attack left Richard's face unrecognizable, with a gaping head wound. Naomi Wendorf, emerging from her shower in a bathrobe and holding coffee, encountered the intruders. She fought back, throwing hot coffee and clawing Ferrell's face. Her resistance proved futile. Ferrell bludgeoned her repeatedly with the crowbar until she released her grip. According to his own account, until she let go, I was going to beat the fuck out of her. After the murders, Ferrell and Anderson performed what he called a death dance around Richard's body. They then ransacked the bedroom, stealing jewelry, a hunting knife, and the keys to the Ford Explorer. The scene they left behind was so gruesome that even veteran investigators were shaken. While this occurred, Heather Wendorf waited in a car nearby, with Charity Kesey and Dana Cooper. Her role remains controversial. Did she truly not know her parents' fate, or was her absence calculated? The group fled in the stolen Explorer, heading toward New Orleans with blood on their hands, and a nationwide manhunt in pursuit. The savagery of the attacks suggested more than simple murder. For Ferrell, high on acid and lost in vampire fantasy, the killings represented his complete embrace of darkness. I felt like a god, he would later say, displaying the disturbing disconnect between his fantasy world and the brutal reality he had created. The manhunt began with Jennifer Wendorf's horrified discovery of her parents' bodies. As law enforcement processed the blood-soaked crime scene, the killers were already fleeing north in Richard Wendorf's Ford Explorer, leaving a trail of evidence that would ultimately lead to their capture. Detective Algussier quickly noted the sophistication of their initial escape. The group avoided major highways, taking back roads through multiple states. In a display of calculated cunning that belied their youth, they carefully disposed of evidence along their route. The murder weapon, the bloodied crowbar, disappeared into the murky depths of the Mississippi River. At an anonymous gas station between Eustis and Baton Rouge, Ferrell shed his gore-stained clothing, though traces of Naomi Wendorf's desperate defensive wounds remained etched on his face. Their journey was marked by near misses with law enforcement. 5 separate police stops could have ended their flight, but each time Ferrell demonstrated an unsettling charisma. Speaking with unnatural composure for a 16-year-old, he spun tales of being college students on a road trip. His stories shifted between claiming origins in Texas or Iowa, depending on their location, yet officers found him credible enough to wave them through. I was speaking to them with every courtesy, Ferrell later boasted. They were expecting a teenage cult-looking psychopath. Instead, they encountered an articulate young man who had just bashed in 2 skulls with a crowbar, but could maintain perfect social graces. The group's facade of sophistication cracked in Baton Rouge, perhaps overwhelmed by the weight of their actions or simply missing home. Charity Kesey made the fatal mistake of calling her family. Within hours, police traced the call to their motel. Local law enforcement, working with Florida investigators, surrounded the building on Thanksgiving Day, just 3 days after the murders. The arrests revealed the true nature of these self-proclaimed vampires, frightened teenagers facing the consequences of their dark fantasies. Yet even in custody, their disconnect from reality persisted. Surveillance cameras captured Ferrell and Charity locked in passionate kisses in their holding cell, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of their situation. During interrogation, the group's unified front crumbled. Ferrell, perhaps playing the role of dark patriarch to the end, attempted to shoulder all blame. But, one by one, his followers revealed their knowledge of the murder plans. Dana Cooper and Charity admitted knowing the violent intentions beforehand. Scott Anderson confessed to his intended role in the killings, though he claimed to have frozen in horror when the actual violence began. Only Heather Wendorf maintained complete ignorance of the plot against her parents, though investigators found her story increasingly difficult to reconcile with the evidence. Phone records revealed long conversations with Ferrell in the months leading to the murders. Witnesses described blood-drinking rituals in local cemeteries. The pieces of a darker conspiracy began to emerge. Detective Garcia's methodical investigation peeled away layers of vampire mythology to expose the brutal reality beneath. The evidence painted a picture not of supernatural beings, but of troubled teenagers whose role-playing had evolved into something far more sinister. The trail of blood leading to Baton Rouge would provide the foundation for multiple convictions, forever changing the lives of everyone involved in this dark chapter of criminal history. Rod Ferrell initially received a death sentence, becoming the youngest person on Florida's death row at age 17. This sentence sparked national debate about executing juvenile offenders. In 2000, the Florida Supreme Court commuted his sentence to life imprisonment after declaring the death penalty unconstitutional for juveniles under 17. By 2018, changes in juvenile sentencing laws required Ferrell's case to be reconsidered. He obtained a prominent defense attorney, Terrence Lenneman, raising the possibility of eventual release. In prison interviews, Ferrell showed disturbing lack of remorse. "When I killed those people, I felt a rush. I felt like a god." He spoke casually of having a woman, Job, and even pets waiting upon release. Scott Anderson received life without parole, but, like Ferrell, faces resentencing under new juvenile offender laws. Charity Kesey served 10.5 years before release in 2006. Dana Cooper completed 17.5 years, gaining freedom in 2011. Heather Wendorf's case remains controversial. A grand jury exonerated her, accepting her claim of ignorance about the murder plans. She relocated to North Carolina, attempted to rebrand herself as Zoe, and became an artist. Her sister allegedly forgave her, though many question her true role in the crimes. Detective Garcia, who initially investigated the case, emphasized this wasn't about vampirism, but rather a bad guy who decided to do bad things. The case's legacy affected both the vampire subculture and juvenile justice reform, highlighting the complex intersection of teenage alienation, fantasy, and violence. The Wendorf murders continue generating debate about juvenile sentencing, the role of fantasy in violent crime, and the responsibility of secondary participants in brutal murders. Rod Ferrell's potential future release remains a concerning possibility, especially given his continued lack of remorse and disturbing statements about the killings.